Hi, my name's Peter. I have bipolar disorder, and I'm just going to briefly share with you what I did to stabilize my condition and to keep it completely under control. Basically, my recovery story. Early on, I decided I was not going to use conventional medicines. I didn't want to use the drugs. I didn't want to use the electroconvulsive therapy. And I started to treat myself with natural remedies, herbs, supplements, brain training techniques, also psychotherapy, diet, and so forth. And for me, these techniques have worked. Since about 15 years ago, I got to a point where I was able to control the condition. Although it was still quite volatile. I have rapid cycling bipolar, but I could see the condition coming, nip it in the bud, and keep it under control with a very hands-on approach. About 7 years ago, I applied a new treatment technique where I boosted the plasticity in my brain. And that treatment has been remarkable. Since then, I haven't had any rapid cycling at all. So I'm able to maintain a very, very stable condition. In fact, I've never been healthier. My condition began at an early age. I was attempting suicide from the age of 13. A suicide attempt would be something like standing on a chair with rope around my neck, or climbing over the railings at the top of a tall building or a cliff and down onto a ledge, and then sitting there trying to get the courage to jump. I tried drowning myself at sea and all kinds of things. That was in the 1970s, and there was no internet, and people didn't talk about mental illness in the way that we do today. So actually, it's hard to understand what I was thinking, but I didn't know I was mentally ill until I got to university. At university, I was studying pharmacology and neuroscience, and we were doing a module in psychiatric medicine, and I had to revise what are the classifications of the psychiatric disorders. And I suddenly saw myself in this book I was reading, and I thought, oh my God, I'm mentally ill. And it all just made sense then. It was like a light bulb moment. Yeah, all those suicide attempts. I knew there was something different I was doing because there was never anybody else up there. Now, I didn't want to tell anybody that I was mentally ill. You know, there's many reasons for not doing that. There's shame, there's stigma, there's fear of having it on your mental records and the negative impact that might have on your career and so forth. So I kept it all a big secret. The manias have become more extreme in my early 20s at university, and they were more rapid cycling. But I was doing a bit of cocaine, a bit of partying back then, and so if I was a bit crazy sometimes, people just thought I was high on drugs. Anyway, I went and asked the professors, do we know what really causes mental illness? I wasn't saying it was for me or for a friend. I was just pretending to be a really keen student, and I was a really keen student because, you know, I had a personal vested interest in this. And the professors told me, no, we're not anywhere near discovering what causes mental illness. We barely even know how the drugs we're using work. We just accidentally discovered some drugs that worked for different conditions, and we started to reverse engineer how they worked. And all we do now, the industry is just based around looking for updated versions of those drugs that have less side effects and are more profitable. So that didn't sound good. I then went and spent the next 3 weeks in the university library in the psychiatry section reading case histories to see what the future held for me. What was the prognosis of my condition? Prognosis is the expected development and course and outcome. And what I discovered was that if you start with a mental illness at a very young age, 13, in fact, I first started thinking about suicide at the age of 11. And if it was pretty serious, and multiple suicide attempts would classify it as serious, then the prognosis looked terrible. My chances of recovery were somewhere between 0 to slim. So I was pretty depressed about that, suicidal again. Of course, by recovery at that time, I thought like spontaneous cure, or maybe some treatment would cure me. I had no way of knowing that I was going to be able to work out a way to keep the condition completely under control without any of the side effects of the drugs. That's what I was looking at. I thought these drugs and treatments can work. They don't always work that well, so that's not good. And they also have severe side effects, so that's not good. And to make matters even worse, my mental health condition started to deteriorate. The manias were becoming more extreme, not full hypermania or what you just call mania, still just within the top end of hypomania. I could sort of get away with it, although people were noticing that I was odd or doing something different, and they would comment on it. And when I say comment, I mean not in a like supportive, friendly way. And I also became rapid cycling, whereas before I would have a sort of a 3-year-long depression followed by a very brief hypomania. That was my teens. Now in my early 20s, I could be up and down within a week, certainly within months. I had several experiences where I got completely high, but without taking any drugs. I was in a sort of trippy cocaine state, but I recognized that this is odd because I haven't taken anything. And I also had a very unsettling situation. It really disturbed and upset me, whereby I suddenly came to, became conscious again, on a Wednesday morning walking down a street, and I looked down and I was wearing the same clothes I'd been wearing several days ago on Saturday, and I have no recollection of what happened during those days. It was like just missing blank time. That experience was extraordinarily disconcerting. I was in tears over it, like I was losing my mind. People also were treating me very differently. People were looking at me sideways as if I think they'd seen me around. I don't know if I'd been going back into university and behaving oddly or what I had been doing. Although looking back, I think it's probably hard to say, were people looking at me strangely or was I just being paranoid? Because paranoia was one of the features of my bipolar that I lived with for most of my life. It's a horrible feeling. It's more common in schizophrenia and psychotic conditions, but it can occur in bipolar. It's only just a few years ago, actually, I worked out the solution to that. I stimulate the NMDA receptors in my brain that dampens down that hyperactivity. And that was one of my best pieces of work, actually. I took some work from schizophrenia and reverse engineered it to see if it would work for my own paranoia, and it did. Anyway, because of the situation and some paranoia, I was terrified that somebody was going to discover me and realize that I was mentally ill. And somehow I would end up being forcibly hospitalized, sectioned. So I went on the run, basically, never staying too long in one place for anybody to get to know me. And at university, you could be quite anonymous. I took a year off from university, actually. The cover story was that I was going to do voluntary work overseas in Calcutta with dying destitutes and refugees and so forth. And it would be part of the course somehow. And I did do that work, actually, during the day. And then in the evening, I was thinking about trying to work out whether or not I should kill myself and how exactly I was going to do it. What were my prospects of getting well? Was I prepared to put up with however many more years I had on this planet? I'd been brought up by religious parents. I was told I was going to go to hell if you commit suicide, and that bothered me. So there was a number of big considerations. Whilst in India, I met a guy who was a counsellor and therapist, and he gave me some psychological techniques. And this was really new. I didn't know that you could change the way that you thought, that you could challenge the way you thought, that you could change your perspective on your problem. And this helped marginally, but really did genuinely help. It didn't stop the condition, but it gave me better coping strategies. And I got by with these techniques for the next couple of years. It didn't stop the condition from happening. I had background depression all the time, and I would have these hypomanias. I still didn't have the proper diagnosis back then. I didn't recognize the hypomanias. The absence of the extreme hypermania meant I didn't get diagnosed as having bipolar. By the age of 25, 26, I'd left university, I was in therapy, and I trained in nutritional medicine. In addition to doing psychotherapy and nutritional medicine, from my mid-20s to my 30s, I did every kind of therapy I could try. I did like crazy stuff, like I had my chakras aligned by crystals and so on and so forth, really far out stuff. And it was a stretch for me because I came from a scientific background, and I got a lot of criticism from friends and family members because this stuff was just so weirdly alternative and there was no scientific basis for it. The only thing I can say back to that is, look, it's easy to be critical when you're not the one staring down the barrel of a gun. I was fighting a battle for my life against an illness that kept trying to kill me. It's easy to be mocking of the therapies a person will try when you're not the one that's having the Grim Reaper try to grab them by the back of the collar. And I spent a small fortune on these therapies. But then what price do you put on a human life? I didn't know what was going to work. Some of those things did work, and I survived, and I'm still here to tell the tale. Out of all the therapies I did, most of them had no effect on the bipolar condition whatsoever. The therapies that made a difference I say the therapies that make a difference for mental health problems. You need to manipulate your biochemistry, and I did that through nutrition and natural remedies, or you can use pharmacology. Brain training, you can do a lot with brain training. Meditations, that's the sort of thing I mean when I say brain training. Enforced, repetitive, holding the mind in a particular zone to stimulate neuroplastic growth and development of that psychological trait. Good psychotherapy helped me a lot, particularly to remodel traumas. I'm not particularly saying I carry more trauma than anybody else. That's not what's important. What's important is that some of us, and I'm certainly one of them, are more vulnerable to stress physiology causing inflammation in the brain that then triggers mental health problems. I started to use the biochemistry, pharmacology, neurophysiology I'd learned at university with this nutritional medicine I was learning. And I found that I could boost my neurotransmitters, lift myself out of a depression. What would happen then is that would flip me up into mania. If you've got bipolar and you take anything that's antidepressant from a natural remedy to a drug, there is a risk it's going to flip you up into mania. Now, the manic side of my condition at that time had gone back to being just quite mild, only hypomanias. I think that the more extreme borderline manias I was having at university were probably the result of all of the drugs and partying and so forth I was doing. I then spent the next 15 years, from my mid-20s all the way through to 40, kind of half controlling my condition. My strategy was simply to antidote the depression whenever it returned. I didn't know I was manic most of the time by now, because I just kept boosting my neurotransmitters, lifting myself, in fact, flipping myself, because you can do that if you've got bipolar and you take antidepressant drugs or including natural remedies. You can flip yourself up into mania. And I still didn't recognize these hypomanias. If you've got bipolar, you'll know what I'm talking about. When you're depressed, you know you're depressed. But recognizing when you're inside a mania is tricky. I'll say more about that somewhere else. So I'd have one of these hypomanias and then be full of life and full of work, and I was very productive. And then all that energetic state in the mind in the brain is unsustainable, would then collapse into a depression. Whereupon I would use my natural remedies to antidote the depression by boosting serotonin and dopamine. I actually went and dropped boosting dopamine for a long time and just boosted serotonin. And it worked for me. I got by with this for 15 years, all the way through till the end of my 30s. Life was actually good at that time. I had a large successful practice. I was practicing functional medicine. I was at a top clinic in London, and actually one of the top clinics in Europe, and I had a 6-month waiting list. So the last few years of my 30s and into my 40s, I was basically hypomanic for about 7 years. I actually thought that I was a really positive, energetic, upbeat person who just suffered from depression. What I didn't realize was that that really positive, energetic, upbeat person was actually a hypomanic state. But of course this was unsustainable. You know the expression, what goes up must come down, or to be specific, when you're in a manic state or hypomanic state, systems in your brain are firing at such a fast rate and so energetic that they eventually become exhausted. After 7 years or so of this, I just started to lose my edge. I thought, I don't like my work anymore. I don't like anything anymore. And it was not like the painful depressions I used to have. I just felt less enthusiastic about things. And slowly, over several years, I slid down into a depression where I felt numb, no interest, no enthusiasm, no purpose for life. It was horrible. And it lasted for 5 years. Again, nearly killed me. The strategy I had used successfully before of boosting serotonin no longer worked. And I was coming to the conclusion that I'd had a good run at being free from mental illness, but in the end I hadn't overcome it, and I started to plan my own suicide again. Then I had my next really big breakthrough. Today, you know, you can look up what serotonin is like or dopamine is like and the differences between them and what they do, but that wasn't so clear back then. Anyway, I realized that everything I was feeling was nothing really to do with serotonin, but everything to do with dopamine. All the characteristics. Dopamine gives you drive and energy and excitement and enthusiasm about doing things and trying new things. Now, if you imagine that you take that away, well, that's kind of like where I was. And so my last ditched attempt before I was going to kill myself again, I put in a bowl a stack of remedies to boost dopamine. Put it by my bedside with a glass of water. My life had shrunken at that time to a tiny little shell of what it had been. I was only able to work about 6 hours a week. I was socially isolated. The depression had taken everything away from me. Friends, finances, just everything. It was horrible. And put this bowl by my bedside, hoping that something was going to happen. Woke up midday, you know, I couldn't get out of bed till midday. Swallowed these pills, actually went back to sleep. And then within a few hours of that, I was standing in my kitchen, my hands on my hip, looking up at the wall. And I said, excuse me for swearing, I'm sorry if you don't like swear words. I said, what the fuck just happened? I'd actually gone and put a spice rack up on the wall. And this spice rack had been sitting there in the corner of the kitchen with the screws and drill and everything waiting to get put up on the wall. I had energy and enthusiasm and motivation. And I thought, this can't be possible. I can't have literally antidoted depression in just a few hours. But I didn't feel depressed. It seemed okay. So I took the same things again the next day, and yes, it worked, and the next day and the next day. But then within about 5 days, I was in a very strange state. I felt agitated, speeded up. Everything was too quick in my mind. And also maybe slightly depressed mixed in there. It felt a bit like you'd taken, say, 10 coffees and a shot of tequila, and maybe a little bit of cocaine, if you know what that feels like. I hope you don't. So I thought, well, you know, I'm new to these remedies. I'll need to just get the dosage right. So I stopped taking them, slid back down into depression, redosed at a lower level. Over the following weeks and months, I would go through phases where I had got the dosage wrong. I was taking too much of these remedies, and I'd be in a manic state. And then I would take it down and I'd go depressed, and I was manic, depressed, manic, depressed. It became really obvious that when I didn't have enough dopamine, I was going into depression. And then when I had too much, I would go into this hyper-energetic state. And this was what showed me I had bipolar disorder. It was absolutely clear. I had actually been, back in my early 30s, to see a psychiatrist, private psychiatrist, and he told me I had bipolar, but I rejected his diagnosis. I didn't want to believe it. So all credit to him, he was right. This was like my second life revelation light bulb experience. Okay, I've got bipolar. What am I going to do about that? What do we know about bipolar disorder? Right, we know dopamine can go too high. It seems like it can also go too low. So I'm going to learn to take control of my own dopamine levels. There's this other neurotransmitter called glutamate. So that goes shooting up and that causes the raw speed. It was actually very difficult to find remedies to bring down the glutamate, but I now have got that done. So I learned to dampen down my glutamate, push up or down my dopamine. I already knew how to manipulate my serotonin levels. So I decided that if my brain is not going to keep its dopamine, glutamate, norepinephrine, serotonin levels in balance, then I'm going to have to manually balance them myself. Kind of like a model like being a diabetic. You know, a diabetic doesn't make enough insulin and can't control their insulin blood sugar levels. So they test them and inject a medicine to adjust the levels. So then I developed the idea of, can I monitor where my neurotransmitters are, because there's no like blood test for it, and then adjust a prescription to match the needs of where I'm at. In the beginning, what would happen is I'd end up going too manic or starting to slide down into depression, and then I would have to adjust. So I was kind of playing catch up. But within a year, I got to be smarter at this. I got to be able to see the condition coming in advance, even the manias, and it's very hard to spot manias and mild hypomanias. I just use a 3-point plan. So if I see myself speeding up in my thinking and my body movements, if I see myself having a diminished need for sleep, and also thinking about reckless, hedonistic thoughts, so risk-taking, if I'm drawn to drug, sex and rock and roll, or just even thinking about all of that stuff. Each one of those is like a red flag. 1 red flag, maybe that's okay. 2 red flags, yeah, be cautious. 3 red flags, in fact, you're already in it. I'm already then manic. I got to be able to see the manias coming days before they came, and I could adjust the prescription. Then I entered into another great period of my life. I very much enjoyed those years. I felt like I'd cracked this thing. I could control it rather than it controlling me. Although I did have to be on its case all the time. I had the rapid cycling, so 6 times a year my condition would try to derail me, and I would nip it in the bud, wait a couple of months, nip it in the bud, and so on and so forth. It was a funny thing, actually. I didn't know where to pitch my level of dopamine and norepinephrine and glutamate, so I kept trying to pitch myself at being a little bit hypomanic because it feels good, but then I would crash and burn. You know the story about Icarus with the wings stuck together with wax, and he flew too high close to the sun and the wax melted. Anyway, within a year I learned to keep myself stable, and I had about 10 great years like that before the next and final chapter. So that brings me up to 2012. I started to notice I was forgetting things, and I couldn't remember faces. And I couldn't do maths in my head. I'd always been quite good at doing mental arithmetic, but I couldn't do it anymore. And a couple of other, my hearing significantly declined. And I was very upset about it. I was 52 at that time, 51, 52. So I was looking online to see what was going on, and it looked pretty bad. I realized that I was entering into early cognitive decline, that the parietal lobes particularly, that's, maths and faces and so forth, the functionality in that part of my brain was declining, probably from the multiple years of high glutamate that I'd had during the years I didn't control my bipolar. And I remember thinking, this seems really unfair. I've been dealt some hard cards here, because it doesn't feel that long that I've finally mastered the bipolar, and now I'm going to develop cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. That's a tough break. And on the entire internet in 2012, hardly anybody was talking about neuroplasticity, BDNF, that's a protein that boosts neuroplasticity. And certainly no one talked about how you could manipulate those things with diet and supplements. Online, I found this little list of herbs that the pharmaceutical companies had tested to see if they could boost brain plasticity. And this list looked like it was a photocopy, if you know what that is, of a fax, if you know what that is, of a PDF. Anyway, I said, look, I've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Let's see if I can repair my own brain, boost my own neuroplasticity. I knew all of the herbs that were on that list, I'd never taken them all together at the same time. I thought that would be a strange formula, but what would happen if I took everything that could boost neuroplasticity from that list and other things that I could find, all at the maximum possible dose, all at the same time, while simultaneously engaging in vigorous aerobic exercise, making sure my sleep was right, my diet was absolutely on point, and so forth. I ran that treatment for 3 months and the results were phenomenal. I just cannot tell you. So let me share one thing that happened was, so my hearing had declined. I was in shops kind of like saying to somebody, sorry, could you say that again, please? And some 20-something guy would shout at me, it's, $4.99, sir. It was awful. It was embarrassing. I was only 51. Anyway, my hearing didn't just go back to being okay. No, my hearing went back to better than it had been in my 20s. And you might say, how do I know this? Well, I have the radio on a lot while I'm writing, and they cycle pop songs. And pop songs would come up that I had been humming to without understanding the lyrics since the 1980s or even the 1970s. And suddenly I could hear the words, I could hear every word. I would look at the radio and sort of say, what did you just say? Oh no, that's just ruined that song. I had literally had decades of songs ruined because I could hear every word. Now you might say, but did you upgrade your hi-fi? Because a modern high fidelity hi-fi is going to give you better sound rendition. No, I didn't actually. I've got a really, really old hi-fi. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's got a good sound. So that was my hearing. My facial recognition just came back. I remember the moment it came back. I was standing on a main street in London called Oxford Street, and some guy had grabbed my hand and he's shaking my hand. And this is a Saturday, a day off. I'm in civilian clothes. I'm not in my clinic. And I'm guessing it's a patient, and I could feel my brain going tick, tick, tick back through the memory banks. And I got him. I got the file, remembered what condition he had. I was able to ask him questions and so forth. So I more than achieved what I wanted to achieve. But it didn't stop there with just the recovery of my hearing and facial recognition and certain other things. No, it went beyond that. I was still having to boost serotonin and dopamine at that time. I gave that up. Didn't need it anymore. Especially serotonin. I'd been taking serotonin boosting remedies off and on for, since the 80s, a long time. And didn't have to do that anymore. And the rapid cycling feature I had, so every couple of months, my bipolar were trying to derail me, that stopped completely. Since 2012, it's now 2019, I'm making this video, I've had one attempted manic hijacking, and that occurred because I deliberately tried stopping my maintenance remedies, neuroplasticity boosting remedies, to see if I was 100% cured, and it turns out, no, there's still some bipolar sitting underneath there, but I just have it totally stabilized. I don't have to be on the case every day monitoring it. I take the same remedies to maintain a good level of neuroplasticity and controlling inflammation, and I'm totally stable. Not a single day of depression. As I'm making this video, it's now October, so I've only got November, December to go of this decade, and I'm feeling fine. When I get through to the end of this decade, in December 31st, will be the first decade of my life since I was 10 where my bipolar disorder did not try to kill me. Incidentally, since I developed my own neuroplasticity boosting treatment in the beginning of 2012, that same year, later in the summer, Dr. Dale Bredesen over in California published his work. He had taken 11 people with early stage Alzheimer's disease and reversed the Alzheimer's in 9 out of 11. Then in 2015, I think it was, Dr. Karazian published his book, Why Isn't My Brain Working? And if you look at what he's saying all the same stuff as I did in my treatment, as Dr. Dale Bredesen is doing in his treatment. We're now on the cusp of knowing how to repair brains. And this has huge implications for conditions like depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. So there you have it. Look, I've made this video a bit too long already. I'll tell you more about the remedies and treatments I use as a maintenance in another video. Just before going, I want to say to you, if you're out there with bipolar disorder or chronic depression or anxiety and other mental health problems, We now know more about what causes mental health problems than you might realize. There's a lot that you can do. I've told you a story about recovering slowly over decades with many trials and tribulations, but you don't have to go through that. My mission in life and in making these videos and my website and so forth is to help people to work out their personal solution in the same number of weeks or months that it took me years. Bye for now.